before the firing squads, before the gulags, before the purges, there was a field, and on that field stood a farmer. He wasn't rich. He wasn't an enemy. He was simply free. But to Joseph Stalin, freedom in the hands of a peasant was more dangerous than any army. In the early 1930s, he declared war, not on nations, not on leaders, but on his own people. It was called Dekulakization, a word that sounded bureaucratic, until you saw what it meant. Families torn from their homes, villages erased, entire communities branded as traitors, and it all began with one man's obsession: to break the spirit of the land. When the Russian Revolution ended, the countryside tried to breathe again. Peasants took back land, tools, and hope. They called themselves Kulaks, a word that once simply meant fist. Strong-handed farmers, those who owned a little more than others, a horse, a plow, maybe a hired worker. For years, they were the backbone of the Soviet food supply. They grew the grain that fed the cities. Even Lenin had warned against attacking them too harshly. But Stalin saw something else. To him, the kulaks weren't partners. They were a threat. They represented independence. And in Stalin's Soviet Union, no one was allowed to be independent. In 1929, Stalin signed a new decree: the liquidation of the kulaks as a class. No trial, no definition, just a signature, and a death sentence for millions. As historian Robert Conquest wrote in The Harvest of Sorrow, Stalin's war against the kulaks was the first great terror, the model for every purge that followed. Within months, tens of thousands of families were labeled enemies. Their property was seized, their animals slaughtered, their homes burned. Some were executed on the spot. Others were packed into boxcars, bound for the frozen camps of Siberia. All for owning too much grain. All for refusing to surrender their land. When Stalin declared war on the kulaks, the battlefield wasn't a front line. It was every village in the Soviet Union. The orders came quietly, through party committees, local councils, factory meetings. Each town received a list, names, families, people to be dealt with. Stalin's new enemies were not soldiers or saboteurs. They were farmers, neighbors, the man across the fence. According to historian Sheila Fitzpatrick, the campaign turned society against itself. Villagers who once shared tools and bread were now forced to denounce each other for survival. Propaganda did the rest. Newspapers called kulaks bloodsuckers of the working class. Posters showed them hoarding grain, while starving children looked on. It was no longer about food or land. It was about loyalty. Those who handed over grain to the state were called true communists. Those who resisted, even silently, were branded as traitors. By 1930, the machine was in full motion. The OGPU, the secret police before the NKVD, oversaw the arrests and deportations. Trains rolled out day and night. Boxcars sealed shut with chalk marks. Each one holding another enemy of the people. As historian Anne Applebaum described it, it was a social execution, a killing of identity as much as of life. Within a year, entire villages had been emptied. Fields stood untended. Cows wandered through the ruins of barns. The Soviet state called it progress, The peasants called it the end. By 1932, the war against the Kulaks had left the land broken. The fields that once fed Russia now lay empty. The farmers who knew how to grow food were gone, deported, imprisoned, or dead. Those who remained were terrified. They worked not for their families, but for the state, under Stalin's new system of collectivized farms. Every grain of wheat was counted, measured, taken. Soviet agents arrived with quotas, numbers higher than any harvest could meet. When villages failed to deliver, the punishment was simple. They were sealed off. No food allowed in. No one allowed out. As historian Timothy Snyder wrote in Bloodlands, the Soviet state used hunger as a weapon. It punished entire regions for disobedience, until starvation itself became a form of control. In Ukraine, in the North Caucasus, and across southern Russia, millions starved. People ate grass, bark, and sometimes each other. It was not nature's famine, it was man's. According to historian Robert Conquest, the death toll reached at least 5 million. Many of them former kulaks or their families. He called it the harvest of sorrow. Still, Moscow denied everything. Foreign journalists were shown full markets, staged feasts, smiling peasants. The truth was buried under slogans of success. In reality, the countryside was dying in silence. A survivor from Kharkiv later recalled, "We learned that in this land, to ask for bread was to commit treason." By the spring of 1933, the kulaks were gone, not just as a class, but as a people. And Stalin had proven a terrible lesson, that terror didn't need bullets, only hunger. By 1934, the war was over. The fields were quiet again. The propaganda posters declared victory. The kulaks have been liquidated as a class. But there were no parades, no songs, no graves, only empty homes and children who could no longer remember their parents' names. Stalin had done it. He had broken the peasantry, the largest class in the Soviet Union, and replaced it with obedient laborers who owed their lives to the state. The party's reports called it success. Collective farms were now flourishing, production rising. The truth was printed in red ink and lies. According to historian Sheila Fitzpatrick, by 1935, Stalin's control over the countryside was total. The fear of being called a kulak haunted every Soviet citizen, and that fear was the foundation of his dictatorship. Behind that voice lay millions of dead. Families erased from memory, their names replaced by statistics. As Anne Applebaum later wrote, what Stalin built was not just power. It was the art of erasing those who once existed. The peasants who once fed an empire had become ghosts. Their fields were green again, but the soil was fed by suffering. And Stalin sat at his desk, reviewing reports of grain production, signing papers, and planning his next war, this time against his own party. The Great Purge was waiting. The war against the kulaks wasn't just about land, it was about control. It was Stalin's first rehearsal for absolute power, and it worked. The price was written in hunger, fear, and silence.